Welcome to another episode of Systematic Geekology. This is a space where we seek to create and cultivate healthy conversations between those things we geek out on and the philosophical and theological questions that often arise out of our fandoms. Like, what does it mean to be human? What makes a hero? What makes a villain? How do the stories and narratives we geek out on shape how we live in the world? We are your priest to the geeks. We aren't all ordained, but we see ourselves as mediators at the intersection of geek culture and going deeper in our faith. We don't always have to agree, but we do respect each other, and we see everyone as a beloved child of God. Everyone geeks out on something, so come geek out with us and enjoy the show.
You're listening to an Anazal Ministries podcast.
Guys, this is Systematic Geekology. We're the priest to the geeks. I'm your host, Christian Ashley, joined today by a special friend. You've heard him before on the show. You've seen him multiple times over, but Tripp Fuller is here. Hey, Tripp. How's it going?
It's going great. Looking forward to some Battlestar Galactica excitement.
Absolutely. I am a huge fan of this show. Have been ever since I first watched it with my dad forever ago. We'll get into that later. So, Tripp, this is part of our primarily political series where we're going through different fandoms, seeing how they handle the politics within the shows. You've been listening, you know. So one of the things we're doing in this special little side series is asking everyone like who their favorite political figure is from real life or fandom.
Ooh. I mean, it's hard. Like, if we're meaning like someone that held office, like the whole New Deal period is my favorite period of American history. And, but, I wasn't alive for that. I mostly am the perpetually disappointed, Bernie bro of sorts. That's tends to be my experience with America. Deeply suspicious of the unity around our foreign policy and its deep commitment to the military-industrial complex. So,
I see. Now, I was already on an episode, and I already talked about Paul von Oberstein from Legend of the Galactic Heroes being my favorite. So I'll go with a real-life one this time around. And I don't know if he's my favorite, but he's the first one that popped in my head, and that being James Polk, who came in for 4 years, had like 5 things he said he was going to do, accomplished those 5 things, and then left the system. That kind of makes me happy.
Yeah, that bygone era there.
Yeah, I'm sure the man had other things and controversies in his life that we shouldn't be happy about, but what politician has ever been perfect? You know, what person has ever been perfect? So, in addition to all that, is there anything you've been geeking out on, Tripp, recently?
Well, I just watched Dune 2, and that was spectacular.
Yeah, everyone look forward to the What's New episode that Will and Justin and TJ and Will's daughter, whose name escapes me at the moment, just did. Very good stuff. So let's get into the series proper. Like I said, primary political is kind of focused on the politics, not only in our world, but also in the worlds of the fandoms that we exist in. And it's nice to have you, Tripp, you know, as much as we love Lord of the Rings here, like you have other fandoms you're a part of. And this is most definitely one of them, from what I understand. So this is Battlestar Galactica. How would you explain that to someone who'd never seen the show before?
Well, I mean, there are 2 elements. I mean, it's a story that's been retold, right? So the version that came out 2004, 3 years after 9/11, picked up an old TV show that apparently was big. It seems kind of cheesy and not that wonderful to me, but I know people get really into it. But it is, it's an exploration using science fiction of humanity's biggest problem, namely our desire to be like God in a whole bunch of different ways. I'm sure we'll end up getting to talk about it, but it gets explored in our relationship to technology. It gets explored in relationship to what we create and then how it recreates us. It gets explored and what can we as a species break this cycle of victim and violator. And the big kind of thing, I guess we should, it's spoiler alerts, like, because there's no way to talk about this without it. But at the very beginning of each episode with this really cool music, it goes, the Cylons, we created them. Then they evolved and then they rebelled and they have a plan, right? So like that's the framing of it with this mini series. It starts with a very much 9/11 resonating nuclear attack kind of thing. But as you go through the whole story, we realize that there's been cycles that have gone like this, where humans have like evolved technologically to the point of creating artificial intelligence, and creating, here are the Cylons. They end up rebelling. There's a big war. Only a few people survive. Eventually, they get to another hospitable planet, and it happens again. And so the story is one, like, as you're piecing together what's happening in the 50,000 people left on the one ship without enough technology to get hacked, you discover that human beings have acted a fool in this way, and then thought the solution was violent attacks on their creation, the Cylons. And Cylons have this, like, oh, we have to eliminate them thing. So there's this whole cycle of violence that you learn you're a part of as you're experiencing this one big story, throughout all the seasons. So it's and it's got like one of the coolest casts of all time.
Oh yes.
So like it's just it's a banger in every way possible. It does the coolest space fights with low tech. That it's just, there's really no reason that if you haven't watched this show that you should not go dedicate some time to go watch it, because it's just delicious in every way. Science fiction's delicious, and that's not just because Starbuck is in it, but a part of it.
Yeah, a 2-episode miniseries and 4 seasons worth of some solid, good fun. Like, you guys are missing out if you haven't watched this show. Now, this is, like you mentioned, a reimagining of an earlier shows from 1978. When the new hotness was that sexy new thing on the block, Star Wars. Everyone decided, well, we got to have our own slice of the pie, but we have to do it on a television budget, and that's how Battlestar Galactica came about.
Yeah,
and it's okay. I'm glad it exists. If it didn't exist, we wouldn't have the reimagining that we do in 2003, 2004. It's fine. You get some wacky goofiness, and then you get Galactica 1980, and you kind of wish she would just die. There's some good things to choose from. There's some things you probably just avoid. There's a baseball episode on Earth.
Yeah, like that's if you're going to go to Earth 2, you may as well play baseball.
Yeah. So that's that. So, Tripp, what was your introduction to Galactica? Did you start from the very beginning? Were you brought in later on?
Oh, well, yeah, I watched it as it was coming out. I was in divinity school at Wake Forest University, and those of us that were, the geeky types watched it and then debate it throughout. And so the number of times me and all of my cigar smoking, whiskey drinking friends watched it and then would sit outside and discuss it as high. So it's really hard to untangle how much I love the show from that kind of like first viewing with like people that remained your friends at the time you're kind of discovering your theological sea legs and understanding your vocational identity and like encountering all the new things you discover in divinity school. And we all were right out of undergrad, right? So 9/11 happened when I was a sophomore in college, and then this show kicks off right as we're in the middle of Iraq and things. So it was the kinds of things it was making commentary on when we look back were what was going on in it. So it was like simultaneously amazing sci-fi, and if you're at that period of time where one of your recreational activities is arguing about religion and politics with your friends, it's like what better context can you imagine? Later, I rewatched it, like binge watched the thing during sometime when I had the flu, years later, and maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I was teaching an undergrad philosophy and culture class. It was one of the shows we used because undergrad students hadn't seen it, and so when I'm teaching like philosophy of religion type things or philosophy and culture things, I find using sci-fi or zombie apocalypse stories or things like that, or doing Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings and Contra, like those kind of things allow people to learn the language and concepts and such that you use doing philosophy of religion without talking about one of the students' personal religion in the class. So you like learn how to use the ideas without different people getting defensive or such. Plus, it's also just entertaining, right? Like if you're be like, do you want to go read Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion, or do you want to watch Battlestar Galactica? What do you? My homework. My homework.
Choice.
Yeah, the students that did their homework went up dramatically.
Yeah, I started not too long after it premiered. I know my dad was there day one because he had watched the original series, and that there was a whole. I remember it being in the news a couple of times, how people hated the new series because it betrayed the original and all that. It's like, well, I'd agree with you if it was a full-on remake versus a reimagining, but we're trying new things here. So, and then I got into it with him being like, hey, I think you would enjoy this too. We would watch it together as it was coming out. Loved looking forward to those nights. It was a lot of fun. Sometimes I think he had to record because he's also a basketball coach. So some days we'd have to record it, wait to watch it together. So it just meant a lot more to me for that to happen. Then in college, I had a good friend, a mutual friend that Joshua and I both have, who every Friday from in the afternoon, we had another friend who had never seen it before. So we invited her to watch it with us. And we would do that pretty much every Friday afternoon. And it was just a lot of fun. It was kind of like, hey, discussing the topics and the themes that were going on in the show on my second watch through of it. And they're also playing the board game together with them, which is incredibly fun and a great way to destroy friendships. But we'll get to that later on. So that's how I got into it. That's how Tripp got into it. Now, I got to ask, they've got a great cast here, like you mentioned before. Like the actresses here, phenomenal. But is there one in this group that's like your favorite?
Oh, I mean, Starbuck's my favorite, but one of the things about the cast in general is it was one of the first sci-fi shows where it had more powerful female characters than male characters, and a lot of the moral complexity that happens through the miniseries and the 4 seasons. It's not possible without like a cast where easily I could think of 4 of the characters that could be favorites if they were in other shows, so that to me is it's hard to pick, but I just it might just be I think Starbuck is the most attractive sci-fi female, and that's like with 6 as an option, so it's it's just there's that element, but also the Gaius character is the one who is the most difficult acting job because he becomes the foil for learning what at least I think the show's big goal of learning is. But he's just so annoying and gross through so much of it that it's really hard to call him a favorite. But yeah. So what about you? Like do you have a hard time naming a favorite or?
Hard time having a favorite? No. Hard time like who would be after them? Yes. As in like because there's a lot of great people to choose from, but it's Baltar. It's Gaius Baltar. He's my guy. He's a slimy, disgusting slug of a man who is going to do whatever it takes to be on top. And whether that is to be like, I know exactly what the Cylons are planning, or I know exactly how this science works, even though I'm making it up on the fly, or I have this angel-like thing talking to me every now and then that gives me hints, or like, I'm going to become president now. Seeing his growth is like, because there is a person in there with morals, but they often get shut up by his desires and saying, you could be so much better. You could be this. I want you to be better than yourself. But also, he's not a complete monster. Like, even in the midst of the Capricorn occupation, like, he's not selling humanity out completely. Like, he's trying to work against the Cylons. There's a lot of moral complexity to him that I really appreciate. In another show, he'd have been written poorly. And in the original show, he's kind of like a mustache twirling evil villain versus what we have here. Like, it's night and day, the difference. Now, if I had to pick someone else, more of a minor character, but Romo Lampkin, the attorney who ends up defending him with Lee, love him. Like, Mark Sheppard has such a presence with him. This is like pre-Crowley for Supernatural, Mark Sheppard, and he does a phenomenal job.
Yeah, in one of the things about his character, and people, obviously, if you haven't seen it, this is just going to ruin everything. But in the miniseries, you discover that he's the one who's responsible for the nuking of Earth. That he gave the codes, access to everything to Six, and that guilt that it generates in him becomes the story he uses to justify throughout the show all kinds of other immoral deeds, be it lying, manipulating. He'll obfuscate in like masterful ways. He will leverage people's passion and desires for safety to generate new enemies. Like you can always see throughout the story that there's both this, like, the version of himself he's telling himself, and then what he's really doing. And it takes it takes all 4 seasons for him to come to grips with like his ultimate betrayal, and then coming to grips with the consequences of him trying to justify it. And I think that really sets up for, the ending of both his kind of decision to go farm, being on what is our Earth, and the debate between him and Six about the future. But yeah, it's his in what's it, James Cal? What's the guy that plays Gaius? James Callis, I think.
That's his name.
He
yes.
Yeah, James Callis. He is a remarkable actor. And it's one of those things where I wonder how much, because the Sci-Fi Channel didn't know how this was going to take off, and then how many seasons you would have. The ability for him to not look like there's this giant disruption in his character where you're like, are you really still playing the same character? But show his wrestling and kind of transformation as a person, when how clear the end was in mind, is very questionable. So I think he did a remarkable job.
I just realized I never talked about what I was geeking out on earlier. So let me do that real quick. That disrupts the entire flow of the conversation, but it's going to bug me if I don't do it. So real quick, Not Somebody's Books of Friends. It's about a guy whose grandmother beat up a bunch of yokai in the past, had names in a book, and now he's got to bring them back to them. It's a ton of fun. It's a very low stakes series, so that's that. We'll get to Baltar later on in this conversation, so sorry to disrupt the flow, but I knew it would be bugging me the entire time if I didn't say anything.
It happens.
So moving on from that interlude, in the show's backstory, as mentioned previously, we have this conflict between humanity and their cybernetic creations. They name them the Cylons. And in Caprica, we kind of start getting that until it was canceled too soon. And they end up rebelling against their human masters for essentially being enslaved, as they have evolved, in a sense, into a sapient species. So what's your take on how the show handled this whole thing, and how does it factor into our more modern issues that we're dealing with, like the development of robotics and AI?
Well, like when I think of the like in particular humanity's relationship with technology, one of the things, the big reveal at the end, where they get rid of technology and kind of hit a technology reset when they get to Earth 2, which is our Earth, right? Like then it flashes forward 150,000 years to the modern day. Um, Part of what the technology question to me is, human beings create technology, it recreates us. And this has been our relationship with it as a species forever. From the time we harness fire, we are now outsourcing quite a bit of our body's energy for digesting food to fire. That's when you start to see the growth of our frontal cortex. What happens with a frontal cortex as a species? That's when we start to develop symbolic language, the kinds of communication where we can cooperate as a species with more than 140 people. That's really the birth of religion. If you look at the kind of anthropological story of religion, and yet human beings, when we talk about technology, we tend to like think it equals stuff that was invented after we turned 30 that we now have to use. So when it goes to humans and technology, there's this we've always created it. It recreates us. And that's all kind of been there. But the technology that we're aware of and conscious of are the ones that make new demands on us, that we have to like relearn what it means to live in a world where this is now part of our lives. And that whole story of technology being at the heart of the cycle, right, of eventually creating artificial intelligence, it evolves, then it rebels, and it starts a whole nother cycle, right, where then you end up on another planet. To me, that it's kind of inviting us as a series to ask, like, can human beings, given our biological hardware, have a culture that evolves in the way it relates to its technology, that we don't end up recreating the worst parts of ourselves in something that's autonomous with more power. And that this has happened over and over again is one place you see it. The other is that when you get to Earth 2, what do? They get rid of all the technology, because what is required for them to do different, and this is one of the places that Balthar's character is so important, like he recognizes that as a species they have to grow through what he's done. Like they have to get to the point of having a different relationship with the other, be it the religious other, the technological creation other. Like you need a kind of cultural moral fabric that enables the breaking of the victim and violator cycle that's at the heart of our species and the way we relate to each other, but also what happens once we create an other, be it, you know, the through technology like the AI, the Cylons here. So
we interrupt our regularly scheduled podcasting for an important message. My name is Tejas. I come to you today to inform you that for as little as $0.00 a week, you could in fact help us by joining our Discord channel. We'd love to talk to you guys there. There's a ton you can do on Discord. You can hang out with us, talk directly to all of the hosts, ask us questions, get more involved in our community, and join in future watch sessions. We like to hop in a voice channel and stream something and watch it that way. It's a really cool way to, you know, get that sitting on the couch experience from home and, you know, living a couple 100 miles away from each other. It is my favorite thing. I would really appreciate it if some of you joined so we could hang out some more. Thanks. And back to your regularly scheduled podcast programming.
I think it's hard for us to, it's not obvious in the show till the end, the big challenge or kind of invitation to wrestle with humanity that it's putting forth. Like it's at the end, this show's not just about the conflicts that are taking place in the present post 9/11. It's actually raising the question of, is what humans call civilization a net good, or is it the very problem that generates our destruction? And that's why I found the show brilliant. I always kind of wanted to know exactly how clear the creators are on the meta observations, but like when you think of what's happening now, we demonstrate the very kind of hubris that Balthar at the beginning of the show has. Like Gaius is sitting there thinking he has the ability to master and control nature, master and control the survivors and all these things because he's at the position of the rational, understanding person. And it gives him a justification structure for all sorts of immoral things, and down to torturing. Like, I mean, you just think of it. Then to go like, what if this shows that it ends and go and gives us a mirror and go, is this who we are? Could we be different? And that's happening precisely at the time we as a nation are telling the story of civilization over against the axis of evil, preemptive strike, and every religious group in the world's like, this is immoral. Like the kind of challenge it puts to us using sci-fi is just it's quite wonderful. That's why I think the choosing a technology that's on our horizon as the place that we're no longer in control of its evolution is insightful. Anyway, sorry.
Man, no. Speak it, man. Yeah, to get to some of your earlier points, you make a great point in saying that technology to us is what's being made right now versus what we're used to. And that's simply not true. Like, yeah, fire was a huge technology. Spears, weapons, being able to hunt beyond ourselves was a huge technology, And we get so used to it, it just becomes ingrained in who we are. And one of my favorite post-apocalyptic books of all time is Earth Abides. And in that, like, humanity's kind of typical scenario, humanity's kind of wiped out. But the issue being, can we maintain civilization as we used to know it in a world where those things don't exist as much as they used to? And one of the ways it answers it is no, you're going to create something else. And in here, we have that post-apocalyptic scenario, like we had 12 colonies, starting with Caprica, that get wiped out except for 50,000 people, and that number dwindles almost every single episode we have in the show, like, because we got complacent, because we decided to make something in our own image. We took that role of God in that scenario. And I'm not saying that robotics inherently is some evil thing, but I'm saying the way it was utilized in this scenario was to say, well, you are going to be subservient to us. You're just a thing. And that's okay-ish if that thing hasn't developed a mind, if it hasn't been imbued with a soul of sorts. And it seems along the way that happens to the Cylons. And when you still treat that thing as if it's just a thing and not a new person, that's how you get into the conflict of this series. And obviously we have some parallels there with how we've viewed other races as subhuman. And therefore we can exploit you in this manner because you're not as important as me, because I'm just smarter and better than you and I have the better technology. So obviously you're a savage, and therefore whatever I do to you doesn't matter. Well, it's kind of the same thing done through robotics. And as AI is being developed here, we see how it's used not only in school with students trying to, use ChatGPT and so on and so forth to cheat and, write their own papers for them. But we also see pastors doing it too, to just have one less thing to do. And the ethics of, is it okay to write a sermon based on what AI has done? It's all over the place. There's so much that the series kind of brings up, and it's like how we utilize technology. And I don't think at the end of the day, this show is anti-technology, but I think it's also, what are you doing with that technology that becomes the question.
Yeah, and one of the things about AI and that we're asking in the present that the Cylons also raise is right underneath, like using AI for homework or any of that, is the assumption that you're using something that's not human and not yours, even though what it's processing, like the way AI works, is actually organizing algorithmically connections between such a large language set of human beings that it works because it is us. Now our relationship to it is its own thing, but it is alien only in the sense that we can't comprehend and control it completely. But it's not alien in that it's using anything other than content created by humans, an algorithm that humans generate. And the shift we're asking now that gets asked in a more complex way with the Cylons is what happens when, in and of itself, apart from human intervention, it develops. And that and what do you do with technology? One of the ways of even thinking about the end of the show in connection to humanity's long time wrestling with the limits of our goodness in a world that's finite and runs on privation is think about what happens when the Hebrew people tell in Genesis 1 through 12, like the creation stories fall all the way through the Tower of Babel, right? Like in it, at the very beginning, the temptation is of the serpent is you'll be like God, right? And what is it that makes you like God? Knowledge. The knowledge to do what, right? Gaius Balthar is the knowledge to control the world around him, to control situations and challenges, and that desire to be like God and control in the Hebrew story, it breaks down. You get Cain and Abel and this kind of battle there, all the way to Babel, which is what humanity as a collective using its technology to overthrow God. You'll not just be like God, but you want to be God-like. And it's that place where in the Hebrew story that you get the multiplication of communities, right? They all don't speak the same language anymore, and here you are, right? The crescendo, if you think of those stories of like a snowball of violence, starts in the garden, and then you get familial violence, and then you get the violence with the land, a farming and hunter dynamic, and then it gets to Noah, and it all the way to Babel. It's like, what do human beings do when they cooperate with and they gain power through technology? They want to be God, and the response there is reset.
Yes,
and so like when you think of and what's the reset? The reset is the setup for why you want a people. You get the scandal of particularity right in Genesis 12. God chooses Abraham and Sarah, but not for themselves, but to bless them so that in the way they enact their relations, they become a light to others, that they are chosen by God to bear the character of God in history. And that's like the framework for understanding the people of Israel. Like the whole reset you get at the end of this, where Six and Gaius are sitting there commenting, right? As there's like a proto robot on MSNBC. You get Gaius say to Six, does all this have to happen again? Does all this have to happen again? And I think that like playing that out, you see how the show kind of gives a prehistory mythology of sorts for us to ask this question again, in the same way that as the people of Israel, when you're trying to make sense of your origin story, what story do you tell that is so true it captures the human predicament? That one. Those resonance there, that the human beings, when they were, that essentially emerges in the early agricultural period for human beings, the early Genesis, we're still stuck asking the same questions about how we are human in a world of multiplicity and difference culturally, where it's easy to generate an other you define yourself against and outsource the villainy to them and then conquer it and tell a mastering story. Like all those things are still sitting there, and it gets explored throughout this whole story, and then it ends and goes, oh, does all this have to happen again? Anyway, yeah, that's a great question. It got me excited. I haven't thought so much about the show till you sent your notes in a while. And then I like pulled out all my lecture notes from when I taught through it. And I'm like, oh, this is good. I love Christian's questions and topics.
well, thank you. Glad to hear that. I love the idea of, hey, this is something that we've experienced, depending on how literally you interpret the Bible. And I tend to go more literal than other people. This has happened multiple times before. We've had a reset button. in that, hey, Noah's flood happens, and outside of Noah's family, there's no one who survives. And now we're back to that very small technological level that some people would argue, and I know it's all over the place, is that because humanity had one common language, we were able to advance scientifically far beyond what even our capabilities today. That I'm not going to argue that right now. That's just something people throw out. Then you have the Tower of Babel situation. Well, we have that one language. What unites us is that goal. We all want to be like God. And what's going to separate us? Scattering us among the world to where we don't have that language that unites us together. We have that same uniting, we all want to be God, but now we can't get over the fact that now I'm a different culture than you in this respect. Yeah, this series is so much fun. I'm glad I fought for this to be on the primarily political series, and I'm glad you could be along here with me for the ride, because I've been wanting to talk about this for some time. But we can't focus on only one question. We do have other things we have to do here. So you go, simpler, no big hot button issue or anything. Early on in the show, I believe second season, there is an intense debate over abortion that is exacerbated by the fact that mankind's numbers have dwindled immensely. We see, like I said, every episode, those numbers start steadily go down as time goes on. And President Rosalynn, who, by the way, is only president because she was the education minister and there's no one else around high enough to do the job.
Yeah, it's like the most depressing designated survivor moment, right? Like that one person that's not at the State of the Union where it blows up and you're like, who's president now? It's like that times 10.
Yeah. So she has her own personal ethics on how she views the issue of abortion. Like in the episode proper, she decides that there's this young woman who says she needs to have one. She allows her to have it, then passes legislation preventing it. Do you agree with how she handles the scenario or not?
Well, I think it's, one of the things about it is it reveals the way, short of having an absolutist statement on anything politically, how the context will shift one's moral reasoning, right? So in our context, you could imagine people saying, look, we are getting past the limits of people on this planet, and we don't need more humans. We keep growing nonetheless, right? And so the survival instinct to make the logic in the present, if you're just thinking of what the ecology can bear, you might go, oh, well, let's limit the number of births. And there's all sorts of different ways governments have done that at different times. And so the putting it in a situation where the survival of the species would demand more births as opposed to less, right, is a way at getting you to it, kind of forcing the viewer to go, is the answer to this question a situationally determined, or is in the context and in the space of humanity one, or is it about a kind of moral universal about the dignity of a human being? And I think that's kind of the brilliance of that situation. Now, her pragmatic one of like right after she kind of makes the new law of not retroactively, right, punishing the young girl. That seems like the only reasonable thing to do, and that's if you're sitting there leading it. Otherwise, right, like you're now like creating a law and making it retroactively, punishing someone. You also see someone who has a deep commitment and sees the need from the voices of people she would normally demonize and think are wrong, to that they have some truth within it that she now has to become a part of, right? So like I find her character through it, it's one of those where, could you have chose otherwise? You kind of want to go, no, I think she makes sense. But then that's like one of Gaius's most nasty moves, right? In that episode is like he gets up there and he basically coerces her into doing it, right? He goes, I've been tracking the data of everyone that's alive, and that number's going down. And if we allow this kind of logic, then he universalizes that one instance, extends it out, and he's like, in 17 years there won't be any more humans. So that like he gives her the justification for changing the law, right, where we're going to outlaw abortions, and then he uses it and says, the Cylons don't want us to have any freedom, and we got to preserve freedom even if it's against, like, or even going to be a free people if we start passing laws like this. So now y'all can vote for me for president. It's one of those times where you kind of just want to punch him. Like she's wrestling with it as a real moral choice, and he's utilizing people's deep moral commitments to get votes, which, depending on the election, we have political parties that use the same issues to generate votes. And I just think we have too many people that treat it like Gaius Balthar and not our favorite space president.
Yes. Well said. Obviously, it's a complicated issue in the real world, but in the context of a fictional universe like this, you have the whole like, hey, our species is dying off. Can we allow this to be a thing? And me, I look at it. I'm obviously very conservative, as has been very present throughout this entire show. I think it's evil. I think it's immoral. I think it's something that is murder. But the end result is I get what I want, but I'm not happy with it. Like, I'm very happy in the real world Roe v. Wade got overturned, but I'm not okay with how it happened. I'm not okay with the people who are utilizing it for their own ends versus the preservation of life, which is what I would go towards. And, the preservation of a human being created in the image of God. And then this scenario, Rosalind, I understand her position. It's one I never want to be in. But I don't agree with how she handles it. I think she's trying to have her cake and eat it too, and that's what blows up in her face. I think if she really truly believes in her heart of hearts that abortion should be legal, she should stick to her guns, because it creates scenarios where we have Baltar manipulating things behind the scenes to be like, oh, well, we're about to die out. Could you possibly allow this to happen? While he's scheming, conniving. At the moment you say yes to this, that serpent offering you the fruit, he's going to turn it and twist it against you. And he declares his own presidency, which she eventually loses along the way, starting with this choice. Now, would that have happened if she had kept abortion there? I don't know, but it certainly doesn't help the matter here. So I'm all over the place there.
But that kind of complexity, right, is the same kind I think we're experiencing now and are going to experience throughout this election season in America, because like assuming the logic of, personhood at fertilization, IVF and rape, incest, life of the mother would essentially be the only ethicist with that position. That's the only one where you're internally consistent. And yet, like, just the offensiveness for 80% of the country that you would give that status to artificially fertilized and frozen embryos is such that that the Republican Party are the ones that actually believe it, because I don't think Trump cares. He paid off people that
he doesn't.
But you see, like, even those that really believe it, whichever one the true believers aren't going to say it during the election because they know it's a losing proposition. That even a majority of Southern Baptists support IVF, right? So the idea, and they make a moral difference, even though it's not. It's a moral difference in interpretation, but it's not about the status of the fetus at that point. It in many ways it is a justified means for giving the family more control than nature gives you over life. And so, like, all what's going on in that, both like one side, a very contextual moral reasoning that's complicated and undermines their deepest commitments, and the other one not caring but just wanting political control and will adopt anyone's deepest commitments, right? Like, both of them have ways in which they're off-putting, and I imagine that, just so, when we're recording this, we're just now waking up to the sequel no one wanted, and that kind of move is going to be rampant. So Here we go.
Yeah.
You know what? Here was a question that came up to me. I had to go look up when it happened because when you sent the outline, it's in season 4 where Ellen, who's like the original wife of like the lieutenant, what was his name?
Saltai.
Yeah. And so she hurt 6, who's pregnant with his baby, right? And it generates a miscarriage in it. And the kind of that story's moral complexity is very different than the conversation around abortion. And I think it's because what's happened since then, right? Like those numbers have gone down even more. People, the kind of fear of the other, right, is deeply a part of it. So 6 is a Cylon. So like, well, and at that point, they think this is a Cylon human child. Hadn't been the big reveal there of who the original 5 are. And so this kind of, it's raising the question for everyone, like, is this a human or not? And that frames the relationship of this potential hybrid child. Does it get dignity or not? Right. And after Ellen's hurt 6 and there's a potential miscarriage, she's sitting there telling her ex-husband, whisper to tell her you love her, and is like in the crisis of the potential loss of this child, is the place where you see Ellen's character awakening to the potential dignity, even if it's not human, fully human, of this child. That episode, I think, is, especially if you're teaching in class on this, where ethical questions come up, setting them next to each other is really helpful, because there's so many places where the other, fertility in the other, has been used by governments regularly in horrible ways. Sterilization of people with mental disabilities, the abortion of white women who have children with people of color, what do you do with the other's children, like the kind of like taking Native American kids in re-education camp. Like you can see how it played out in Nazi Germany and such. Like the politics of life in a time of crisis, like continually gets more complex, all the way. I mean, there are other episodes, but I just thought those two go well together.
You jogged my memory. It's been so long since I've seen that episode in particular. And it's one of those things, for me, it's eugenics versus the preservation of life. And when you start looking at someone as another, when you start thinking, well, oh no, this chromosome is not going to be, in line with everything else. They're going to have Down syndrome. They're going to have they're going to have muscular dystrophy or something like that. If I allow this child to come, well, and decide in that case, oh, this human Cylon baby, even though it's going to be Cylon at this point in time. Do we have the right to kill it because it's not regular? It's not what we want it to be. That's when I have a huge problem. It's like, sure, there are many things in this world. No one wants to have a disability. No one wants to be mentally deficient in certain respects, but that's part of the fallen world that we live in. And that's part of the reality that we live in. Am I going to play God in that factor to then say, you're more worthy of life than them because you fit this mold better? Would be how I would look at that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So moving on from there, we've got all of the delicate topics we're discussing today. And Tripp, you already brought it up earlier. This show was created around the time of the War on Terror, starting obviously with the 9/11 attacks, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq. Your mileage may vary on where you end up on that stage. And the show received many parallels in how the conflict between humans and Cylons were explored. Like when we get to New Caprica, we have suicide bombings by humans to try and kill them. We have religion used as an excuse for war, in that the Cylons have a religion kind of based on this idea of Cylon supremacy. Then we have the Pegasus crew torturing Gina, who is another version of Six, who goes through a lot of physical and mental and sexual abuse. And the Cylons are going to later, torture Baltar for his role. Oh, sorry, I've got to put that image on there earlier. There we go. For how he handles his time as president on New Caprica, and amongst many others. So, what's your opinion on how this is all brought up in the show?
Well, I think it kind of functions at two levels. One is the role of religion through it is like continuously complexified, so that the kind of easy the easy parsing of good or bad religion doesn't hold the longer you move in the show. I mean, like even the relationship of kind of a polytheistic framing and a monotheistic one. In the terrorism elements, like as one comes to understand more of the Cylons and the way they share the humanity of their makers, the line the lines get increasingly blurry, and those lines are the ones required in the story for like terrorism, justification of torture, and these kinds of things. And I think the kind of monotheistic picture that's expressed at the end on Earth 2 problematizes most of the religious expressions prior. And so when I think of post 9/11, it was showing us just how ugly a religiously inspired trajectory of war that works. It problematizes calling one group of terrorists when their story they're freedom fighters. That was running throughout the whole thing. The questions of torture coming up, right? Like, in order to conquer a monster, you become one, and how does that work? The big picture for me is, it can, maybe it doesn't have to be read this way, but at least, and when I watched it the first time, watching it with students, it becomes a real challenge to the kind of legitimation story that neocon foreign policy had after 9/11, where you get this like generation of religiously funded tribal identity. It's where you start culturally, where Christianity's culture dominance in America gets rejected more and more generationally, and so many of the people that I grew up with, Baptist preacher's kid in the South, that told me about Jesus, all of a sudden after 9/11, are the most Islamophobic and the most militaristic, nationalistic people around. That this show for me presented the perversity in ways some people saw it that they couldn't see it if they just made fun of me for going to a protest and clapped when we started bombing Iraq because it's somehow connected to Al Qaeda, which basic awareness of Islam would know they aren't friends, and it's funded by lies that we find out later are or much more strategic, and yet who were the ones that were most patriotic in rallying up to go kill the Muslim others in preemptive strike, which breaks all just war, even just war theory, and rallied around the flag? It was white Christians in America. And that was when, I personally, disengaged from ever wanting to be associated with kind of white evangelicalism, because just the basic teachings of Jesus were offensive. I remember after 9/11 when we were forced to go to chapel at a Baptist school. and on 9/11 there was chapel, and we had just realized when the second plane hit, you realize it's a terrorist attack. And whoever was preaching that day, I guess the Holy Ghost told them to go ahead and do Islamophobic warmongering for their sermon. And after it, everyone starts in a prayer circle, which at a Christian campus is, you don't want to get out Jesus. We're sitting there, my roommate and I, Mike, are sitting there, and after about 30 or 40 minutes of listening to people pray, he runs off, and I chase him because I'm like, good, I don't have to, do this. And he turns around and looks at me and says, I'm not going to curse, but he says, there's only one beepity beep thing Jesus said for today. It's pray for your enemies, and no one's thought about it. And they didn't just not think about it. They completely ignored it, lied to justify going to war, and allowed Islamophobia to run rampant in its churches. And that all that was in that space where I realized I didn't have a home anymore in the place that introduced me to the faith. All those complexities show up in a show, and it was so much more safe for me to talk about those things and share with people who didn't understand me because of this show, rather than if I just read them the Sermon on the Mount. Somehow they already had really good theological dodges for Jesus not really meaning it. But the show introduces the complexities in a way that conversation was facilitated. So that's why I think it's such a wonderful show to capture how we were trying, this show was trying to be honest about the complexity of what's going on. And it shows how religion can actually short circuit moral reasoning and become an ally to things that it theoretically, testifies against in its texts and traditions.
Well said. Yeah, I said this on the Gundam episode we did for this series earlier, but I'm not nearly as jingoistic now as I was when I was, 18 or much earlier. 9/11 happened. I was 10 or 11 at the time. And in the church, thank God, in the church I was attending, it was, hey, we're going to support our troops. But it wasn't like, hey, bomb them all to hell. Me internally, I'm thinking that. It's like, how dare they attack a Christian nation like us in this way? It's like, we should bomb them all to hell, back to the Stone Age, forgetting the fact that I am called to love my neighbor. I am called to pray for my neighbor. I'm not called to stand by and do nothing when they do evil against me and others. But that doesn't necessitate making them this demonic figure that has no redeeming values whatsoever, and therefore it's okay if they end up dying. So wrestling with that as someone who does believe in a just cause for the war on terror is extremely hard, because I don't, as mentioned before, I don't like that we went into Iraq under false pretenses. I would have preferred if we'd have been honest and said, hey, there's a dictator there. We need to get rid of dictators. Dictator's bad. And unfortunately, as a result of that, we end up causing religious strife in the area, causing Shias and Sunnis to end up fighting against one another. And then we have the Kurds, unfortunately, eternally screwed over by whichever side they decide to work with, who should have been made a nation of their own after, France and Britain had their own thing way back in the day, but that's its own issue. How am I supposed to handle this? Well, a show like this can show me, from the perspective of the human, we're going to call them freedom fighters, but they're doing terrorist actions against the Cylons, who are an occupying force. Well, that's a parallel to what these religious groups are doing. They see the United States forces, other nations' forces, as evil, as occupiers, as someone who is destroying their way of life. And you cannot force someone to think the way you do, as even if we think it's the right thing to do. That's something that they're going to have to do in their own time. And it was made very clear. Some of them did not want that. So it leads to the rise of stuff like the Islamic State. And in the show proper, we have all this justification. And that's what humans are really good at. We can justify anything. It starts from the fall. Well, because the woman told me to. Because the serpent told me to. It's not because I wanted to do it. It's they led me astray.
And right, and see, it's that recognition which is why in that moment, both in the show and in American kind of like Christian debate things, it to me, when Jesus says to pray for your enemies, to turn the other cheek, and these kinds of things, that is a particular response to how one breaks the cycle of violence of victim and violator, which in this show, the Cylons and humans have done a whole bunch of times, right? And like you get that in his teachings, but also the cross is the revelation that that's exactly what God's doing. God is embracing the power of perverse civilization that builds crosses for people and does so not by Jesus doesn't bow the knee to Satan and become a kinder, gentler Caesar, or just fulfill all their material needs, or surf off the top of the mountain, or the mount of the temple, and be like, "Look, I'm God." Right? He comes inviting us to internalize and participate in the very coming of God's kingdom, precisely by loving your enemy and turning the other cheek. It is asking us to embody the way that is ultimately exemplified in the cross. That's how you turn enemies into family and friends, is by that means, right? And when you look at this story, both how it plays out, right, going through it, and then you put the big story that this cycles happen over and over again, I have a hard time thinking, like, if you sit there with Six and Gaius at the end, that they think, like, does this all have to happen again? They, in one way, since you'd go, well, not if the same mind is in these people that was in Christ Jesus, who didn't count equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself, taking the form of the servant, even to death on a cross, right? Like, or maybe a community that's identity is understood in how it treats its enemies and those that persecute them, and how they turn the other cheek, and all these kinds of things. And yet what happens so often is the religion that testifies to this enemy transforming kind of love that goes beyond sin, law, and death gets turned into one little box where we do our personal ethics, while we're ultimately subservient to American hegemony and global dominance and exporting our economic system. And so we come up with all sorts of just so stories to act as if Jesus bore a cross so that we could put our enemies on them. And when we do that, to me, that was that was the falsification to me of so much of the faith I was handed. And I remain continuously suspicious of how quickly Christians can change, pray for your enemies and turn the other cheek, and Jesus going all the way to the cross, knowing exactly what's going to happen, right? That's the Mount of Transfiguration. He starts to go down the mountain. It says he turns his face towards Jerusalem. And Peter's like, Jesus, you know what's going to happen there. They're going to kill you. Like, this is a horrible game plan for our coming, bringing your kingdom. James and John are like, why are you going to do that? Like, can we be on the right and left? He's like, you don't know what you're asking for, because it's going to a cross. And yet the moment you hand Christians imperial power and they feel like they are the best stewards of civilization, the body of Christ somehow thinks it could do a better job bowing its knee to Satan that Jesus refuses to do in the temptation. And the end of this story is, will it all happen again? Well, it will happen again, as long as we think that we are in the position, just like Gaius at the beginning, to know enough, control enough, and to know the truth enough that we can decide when manipulation of others happens, when violence is justified, when torturing our enemies can happen this way, when we can tell a story where now everyone's focused on doing X, Y, and Z, and I do this. Christians have spent our entire history, I feel like, testifying that we are just as sinful as the ones that killed Jesus. And then we act like we're the only enlightened ones that can run things. And so let's render everyone into an axis of evil. Or before that, it's a battle from the Cold War. And in the present, it gets strung up on a culture war framing, like where Christians' identity gets rallied because we have to conquer, defeat, and eliminate enemies. And that, to me, is just so sub-Christian. It's as anti-Christ as it gets, without using cool dragons and junk. Sorry, I was my. I didn't preach last weekend, so this, when I'm off, it happens.
I knew what I was getting into when we were going to record this episode, man. It's all good. But I do also know you have many things you have to do today. So I'm going to move on to our next question, even though I would love to spend 3 hours talking about this. So when we get throughout the show from the very beginning, Galactica kind of speaks a lot on paranoia, with one of the many recurring worries of the survivors in the fleet being that there might be Cylons hidden among the fleet. They could be in positions of authority. They could be the guy you just met the other day. Like, in your opinion, how is this executed, and what can we learn from how it's portrayed?
Well, to me, part of the paranoia problem is what it does. Like, paranoia enables the people it generates a tribal identity by finding the object of your ire. And then paranoia now takes all your anxiety and fear in a moment and then generates it on another, and you don't know who they are. It also generates a fear where you might get called the one you're looking for, right? And it is a deteriorous thing towards the kind of the kind of faith, not like in the religious sense, but the kind of trust you need for a healthy cooperative community, right? Like paranoia in a home where like one parent thinks the other one has this agenda or this kid's doing this. Like the moment you think the true story that explains the other is one where they're an enemy and that is the end of their dignity, then it gets ugly. That plays out through it's how, like in one of the most painful, difficult episodes is where Starbuck tortures the Cylon. And it was not in her character until violence, conflict, fear, and these things emerge. The paranoia can short circuit our ability to for moral reasoning or empathy and identification with the other, right? That it is so toxic to the kind of hospitality that's required for genuine relationships. It builds you to put up walls, both to protect yourself from being found out, even if it's not true, because at the heart of the paranoid state of relations that reality is not required for condemnation. And it also, you're building up walls because you don't want to get associated and become guilty by association and things. It really shows how these kind of lies about the other on steroids break down the community's fabric. When you think of it, what is there a particular part of? I mean, I could think of a whole bunch of different moments paranoia pops up, but is there one that is most striking for you? Like when you pick this on the sheet.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I want to say like it'd probably be something like really early on, because I think that's when it was kind of at its height. A specific example is not really coming to my head, but Ellen Ty coming back. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
Just happens to magically come back from the fleet's perspective. And you have this debate, Saul wants his wife back. Like he thought she was gone. You have Bill Adama going, yeah, I don't know about this. Like this is all my Adama senses are tingling.
Yeah.
And you also have Rosalind working for, we just added the number to the fleet. And you have Baltar in the middle of this, being Baltar, and telling them one thing while refusing to tell the audience another about what she actually is. And as a viewer, I'm feeling paranoid because you just told me there's a possibility you just told a lie.
Yeah.
And it's moments like that heighten it, make you feel like you're part of that action. It's like, if I'm here, I have no reason not to trust Baltar. But I, as a viewer, know I have plenty of reasons not to trust him. So they just accept it. And as time goes on, we do find out, hey, Ellen is actually a Cylon. Now, if that had been revealed earlier, how the series have changed. Was that always the plan? I don't think the writers always had a plan, but they eventually made something work. I think work really well, and ultimately. and getting this idea is like it's kind of also inspired by playing the board game. That's where those cards are from. If you're watching this on YouTube, you get handed if you're just playing the game normally, you start the game with one card that reveals if you're a Cylon or not. Then there's a second phase of the game where there's a higher chance of you becoming a Cylon. So that creates paranoia amongst the group of, well, I used to be able to trust this person, but can I trust them now? And like I said earlier, it's a great way to ruin friendships.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of working under the assumption you're on my team, right? And if there's something that makes you go, wait, you're not on my team, you have this belief about Jesus, you have this belief about, inerrancy or not looking at it literally or something like that. And you kind of question, well, are you really his? And then you kind of go back because the obvious answer being, of course, I'm his. So I know where I'm.
Yeah.
But what about you?
Yeah, about a year ish ago, my family moved back to the States, but to North Carolina, and we were in California for 10 years and then Scotland for 3. And so, we moved right after the election before Obama was inaugurated, right, to Los Angeles. And so coming back here and reconnecting with, extended members of family and friends you had and such growing up, like the paranoia things that emerge where they just assume I'm one of theirs and then say stuff is quite shocking. Like having family members that explain to me how Obama was a Muslim and not American.
Gosh.
And yeah, well, they got it from President Trump. So, I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's like people say that and then half the country's about to go vote for him again. Rants about the deep state being kitty touchers and a globalist cabal, that kind of stuff. A neighbor who's like, to me, wonderfully kind, but starts repeating Trump's vermin rhetoric, not knowing he's talking about me when he's mentioning it. That kind of that like the paranoia I had around like trans bathroom laws, and like I was just sitting there going like, well, you know that there are 6,800 and some sexual assaults to children by family members, for one, by someone that's not a family member. But see in one sense you might go like, well, we share the value of kids, but it's not even about the kids at that point. It's about this paranoia of some potential other that you don't understand being in a position that has some connection to you, be it a trans person in a bathroom, a civil servant that's secretly doing whatnot, a president who's in another religion, and probably not even a true president. These kinds of things, and like going out of all these relationships past like kind of thinking, wow, that's an interesting Facebook post, and then showing back up. Like when I think of that kind of paranoia thing, I think, yeah, you know what it does is it contorts the fabric of our relationships in ways that I'm going to build up a wall. I don't want them to like hear me say X, Y, and Z and then judge me for this or that. And then it makes things difficult. And then like it breaks the fabric. And if that's happening, right, like in the show, when you're one of the initial 50,000 humans left and it leads to the death of more and more of them, right? And you think of this show after 9/11, right? Like the impact of 9/11, and then you get Obama as president, and you can see more and more of this stuff go. And I'm sure that you'll have experiences of the same kind of thing from people that are more politically progressive, but like the way where these people, don't share certain values. Now I'm going to inscribe them into this problem where they're vermin to be eliminated, this kind of thing. And it's when the paranoia sabotages your ability to recognize the humanity of the other, then it's deteriorates to our own humanity. And that plays out in the show in ways that when I watch it, it makes me question the way I end up doing it. And when I watched it when I was, not in this context and coming back, it makes me feel like, what is it like if this kind of scapegoat style paranoia, how does it shape me? And whose humanity am I not allowing to come into me, because it would mean they demand recognition that I'm not comfortable giving them, because somehow the difference between us is a difference that gives them less dignity or something.
Yeah. It's not to say, what's the difference between paranoia and being right? It kind of depends on what happens. I'm sure there's some better way to word that, because you have the early church, and they're forced to live in the midst of persecution and not knowing who they can trust and what's going on. Then you have some other people saying, hey, like, didn't you know there's this secret gnosis over here that you have to, I'm the only one who can teach you about. And if you just join this, and your salvation is assured. Or you have someone saying, did Jesus really say that he was God? I mean, surely he was a created being and all this. And you got to wrestle with those. You can't, and that paranoia amounts to something. You got to worry about something like that. That's something to be worried about, is something serious like that. You have a nation state. You have to be worried to an extent about foreign interlopers coming in to mess with you if you're in a current state of war with them, but not at the expense of people. How do you handle all that? I don't know. That's why I'll never go or seek any sort of government office. I don't want to be the guy making that call. But there's got to be a way to have a healthy amount of skepticism in the world around you, to question someone's motives without like questioning them based off of, some stupid reason like race or their political ideology or something like that. Just listen to what they have to say. It's like, hey, I'm conservative. I am never going to vote for Trump again. I voted for him in 2016. I was an idiot. I sacrificed my morals and values to not put Hillary Clinton in office. I'll tell that to everyone here right now. I'm not going to make the same mistake again. If he ends up becoming the Republican nominee, which it sounds like it will. But you've got to have a healthy way of saying, this person is saying this. Do they actually align with what I'm saying? Do they actually care about the same things I do? Are they here in a show like this? Can you trust a person beside you? Well, can you really trust anyone? Yeah, sure, if you know them, if you spent time with them. And that takes time. That takes me getting over, they're the unknown. What do I do with that? And as an introvert, I hate the unknown. And then it requires more work. But it's something worth doing. Now, Tripp, do you have anything else you want to add before we head over to the wrap up here?
Oh, no. But I think, I would just say, I think you're right that there's a difference between kind of a critical, reflective kind of skepticism and paranoia. And it's not just like in retrospect, something appears to be paranoia, like after you know the facts. Part of what the paranoia, the problem that plays out in the show, is that the potential for a reality, even one that is real, gets amplified to the point that other people become victims of a real possible threat, right? So, like, if we think of what happened in the show, think of the way even not just Muslims, Sikh people in America were treated after 9/11, right?
The religious ignorance of it all.
Yeah, but the paranoia was connected to a real thing, right? There was real Islamic terrorism. Is it somehow connected to Iraq when the hijackers are from Saudi Arabia and they don't like each other? Seems weird, but that, like, I think you're right. Like, to avoid it doesn't mean you aren't grounded from somewhere attempting to understand and articulate and embody your own values. It's the kind of dialing up the need, usually for security, right, becomes the justification for all sorts of paranoia. You can think of what happened after 9/11, but you could also think of like in the 90s, people like the fear, and then like Halloween becomes this whole thing. Like you got to check your candy, and like there are lots of times you get these scares, all the way back to like witch trials and such. So like knowing that it's a part of human psychology, that has a positive purpose when utilized correctly, that then when it gets dialed up, you turn it up to 11 of sorts, like something that actually is supposed to help you think of like good or not good, healthy or not healthy, and like making that discernment. Once it gets turned up, where now you're so focused on your own protection, it ends up cutting you off from human beings who are your neighbors. They bear the image of God and could contribute to your own existence. And I think that's where that learning a kind of healthy, critical kind of skepticism is needed. And paranoia type things are a short circuit of sorts to when it's done well.
All right. Yeah. This was such a fun episode to record. I know we have other things we have to do today. So let's head over to the wrap up. And part of what we're asking everyone on this show as kind of like the final question of sorts for this series is like, what real life politician would enjoy your favorite movie?
Ooh, I don't know. I mean, my favorite movie is either, I mean, like I love the Lord of the Rings extended editions. If I guess to count as one movie where I get all three of them, then I think I think every politician could deeply enjoy it, because you see a host of different people who recognize the kind of sacrifices that duty require, the kind of inherited binaries and boundaries to your community of belonging that have to be ruptured to find the birth of a new age. And it places our ultimate deepest hopes in the future are not in the ones commanding armies that come from highborn and with power, but for friends with hairy feet who embrace a task and a burden at a time they would have never choose. And it's their deep friendship that makes a future possible for everyone. And given the way our political system is creating a culture where friendship across longtime enemies, orcs and dwarves and elves, a culture that resists the wisdom that has been handed down, be it from someone like Gandalf, who's been around a long time, or the songs of the dwarves or the council of Elrond, and one that like is the more you break down social fabric, the shallower and fewer friendships are there. And I'm rather confident that the powerful and are not the solution to the problems they've created. And if we spent more time thinking of how we build communities where friendships are formed that can sustain a walk into Mordor, we would have a much more beautiful, world and a very different agenda for political debates.
That was wonderfully and beautifully said. And to pull a full Joshua here, I'm going to go silly on the other end of the spectrum. I already mentioned my favorite movie last time was Return of the Jedi. I don't know if I'm ranking the other movies, if this would actually be my second, but for the sake of answering the question, I think that FDR would enjoy Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I think the man needs a little silliness in his life after dealing with the Great Depression and World War II and his own medical issues. Like I think a little bit of Monty Python could go a long way to making FDR a little happier.
Oh, now the real question is, Episode 6 might be your favorite, but you wouldn't go mess with the prequels prior to 4 and 5, right?
As in,
well, Joshua, he really likes the prequels, and I just found that so disturbing. And I was like, what kind of heresy is this you're passing off? Look, that's why I was checking. Is this like is this a sneaky part of systematic geekology that the prequels all come before Empire Strikes Back?
Yeah, objectively, Empire Strikes Back is the best movie in the original trilogy. I just love Return more.
Look, okay, this is a moment of unity. Joshua, I just want you to know, Christian and I, there's how many deep theological and political commitments do we share? Just that we enjoy talking about Battlestar Galactica, and we're trying to respect each other and had a lot of fun doing it. But you know what? I think we know what the one true heresy is. It's systematic geekology. Commitment to the prequels. What is that? What is that? I think we need to have a high quality trial where he has to have Jar Jar Binks as his defense attorney, and Misa Gunza puts him on trial, trying to pass that off as peak cinema when the other option involves Luke, Han, Leia, and Chewie. What is this?
To speak on Josh's defense, I think you have him wrong. I don't think he likes the prequels more than the original trilogy. I think he's more harsh on them. I do enjoy the prequels. I think they're heavily flawed and should have been written with a better editor for Lucas. But I'll take them over the sequel trilogy any day.
He gave me a hard time on Whole Church Podcast. I don't know if the episode came out, but I was like, yeah, the greatest movie is episode 5. Like, that's the best Star Wars movie. And he was going on and on. I'm just like, I don't understand. That would be like being like, well, what's your favorite book of the Bible? And someone's like, oh, Leviticus. And you're like, but what? And you're like, look, there's lots of cool stuff in there and it's a lot of fun, but like, favorite? Did you write a dissertation on it? They're like, no, I just dig it. And you're like, well, have you thought about any of the Gospels? Nah, it's really not my thing. I like laws about where you're allowed to take dumps. And there's really only one place to go for proper defecation spots as dictated by the divine. And Jesus never covered. All you get is like in Matthew, he says like, don't even mess with the vowel signs on the Hebrew Bible. And so we know it's still true, but like that was already covered. So you've heard it said, take a dump outside the city. But I say unto you, use sanitation. That wasn't in there.
What a wonderful way to end this episode. Guys, thank you for listening to this episode. We had a great time here. I will shout out some patrons real quick. Ethan Overcash, Austin Nance, Amber Riley. You guys are the best. Actually, 2 patrons are on the show currently at the moment, but we don't need to worry about them. They kind of suck compared to these 3. Okay, maybe I just suck. Maybe Tripp's a good guy.
I'll try.
Yeah. So, guys, we didn't cover everything we should have for Galactica today for the sake of time. But if you want us to cover more, let us know. But please remember one important thing. We're all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests.
Hi, my name is TJ. I'm here to tell you about the Systematic Geekology shop. That's where we post all of our merch. It is hosted on Creator Spring, and we have a ton of really cool merch, mostly clothing. We have hats, extra soft t-shirts, sweaters, hoodies, and more. Our hosts wear them all the time. It's actually super comfy. We have glassware, mugs, which everybody loves a good mug. Fill out your cupboard. Get rid of some old ones, which is the part that I never do. That's why I have too many cups. We have cloth bags, posters, and it's really stuff. We like to put our icons on there. We like to put quotes, things we come up with, and it's cool. It's a cool way, and a lot of it is pretty subtle too, to show support for one of your favorite shows. And my personal favorite is actually our SG Dad Cap, which I haven't been reluctant to buy it because now I have to wear hats at work and then I get tired of wearing hats, but it's really cool. It's really understated. It is our logo right here. And then it says Systematic Geekology on the back. It's great. It's a really good hat. We have a few of them floating around. Check it out. And if we could all just rock the SG Dad Cap in public, I think that'd be pretty sweet.
If you love our show, you can follow the whole network in a single feed on Spotify at Anna's Our Ministry Podcast or the network page on Apple Podcasts. There you'll find shows like The Homely, The Whole Church Podcast, My Seminary Life, Let Nothing Move You, Dummy for Theology, The Bible After Hours, as well as mine and my husband's show, The Clydes, where my husband Taylor and I go through weekly discussions in a devotional conversational method to help us all get closer to one another and God.